So first, you are going to hear from Abra, and she's going to be discussing the moment that we're in. And then we'll be hearing from Tony, who is going to lay out the phases of a just recovery, the 6 principles of a just recovery. And then I'll be taking us through how we win and how you can take action locally. And then we'll be doing a Q&A. So without further ado, here's Abra to talk about the moment we're in.
Hi everyone, I'm Abra, and I am going to be going through the heavy part of this evening. The pandemic is an unprecedented crisis that exacerbates existing inequalities such as racism, poverty, and other systems, including capitalism and colonialism, that are at the root of the climate crisis. And COVID-19 really puts into visibility how the status quo economic and social structures do not work for the majority of us. When the crisis hit, 53% of Canadians were already living paycheck to paycheck, and 20% of renters in major cities were spending more than 50% of their income on rent. This means that the majority of Canadians cannot afford to stop working. At least 6 million people have applied for employment insurance since March, and this is the highest level that we've seen since the Great Depression. In addition, 15.5 million people have applied for the Canada Emergency Response benefit. Okay, we need to investigate the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19, however, more deeply than just through this economic lens. We cannot talk about a just recovery from COVID without talking about white supremacy, anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. We're in a moment where anti-Black racism and police violence and brutality is in the spotlight once again, following the recent horrendous murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and the police-involved death of Regis Korchinski-Packet in Toronto 2 weeks ago. Police violence against Indigenous people is also being highlighted again after a police officer shot and killed Chantel Moore during a so-called wellness check in New Brunswick last week. People are in the streets demanding change, not just for police reform, but for defunding the police, an idea that is gaining mainstream traction here in Canada and in the US, thanks to the tireless activism of Black and Indigenous people. In the current slide, you can see a snapshot provided by the organization Climate Justice Toronto of the disproportionate police violence against Black and Indigenous people in Toronto. Just take a moment to take this in. Feel free to add your thoughts or feelings in the chat. So all forms of racism and marginalization are tied directly to who is the most impacted by COVID-19. COVID-19 has had a disproportionate impact and continues to, and risk on Black communities who are more likely to be frontline workers in precarious and low-paid jobs. In fact, on Monday, the Toronto Board of Health voted unanimously to recognize anti-Black racism as a public health crisis. Migrant communities, including farm workers and other temporary workers, where workers lack proper housing, sanitation, and health protections. Indigenous communities that often lack proper housing and infrastructure, including running water and drinkable water. People in prisons and immigration detention, notably, over 30% of people in prisons are Indigenous, but make up only 5% of the population in Canada, as well as elderly communities, especially those in poverty or in long-term care facilities where labor issues exacerbate the spread of COVID. This is illustrated in Toronto, where the burden of COVID-19 is unequal. Data from Toronto Public Health shows that the city's 5 neighborhoods with the highest concentration of COVID-19 cases have significantly higher proportions of people who are low income, racialized, immigrants, and who live in denser housing and have longer commutes. Many of the same communities that are hit the hardest by COVID-19 have always and continue to be at the receiving end of environmental racism. That is, Black and Indigenous communities have been largely targeted for undesirable land uses such as polluting industries and are thus disproportionately exposed to toxic pollutants. And COVID-19 has seemed to result in changes that seem to be in favor of climate justice, such as less use of fossil fuels through less driving and flying, a proliferation of mutual aid groups, and suddenly there's government money for social and economic protections, such as the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit. However, while many of us are distracted by the immediate impacts of the pandemic on our lives, governments are passing legislation and giving out money in favor of fossil fuel corporations during this pandemic, often using COVID-19 as an excuse for why this is necessary. A notable piece of legislation I want to talk about is Bill 1, which is an Alberta bill by Jason Kenney. It's called the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act, and it came into effect 5 days ago on June 5th. And it really lays bare the links between colonialism, racism, and environmental destruction. So Bill 1 gives police the authority to arrest, fine up to $25,000, and imprison for 6 months protests or any kind of so-called interference with public or private pipelines, oil and gas production, highways, railways, and mines. This bill is a direct attack against the Wet'suwet'en land defenders and will interfere with Indigenous people's rights to hunt, fish, or gather on traditional land. The bill will thus criminalize Indigenous people for being on their own land, as well as encourages an increased police presence around communities that are most likely to be killed or brutalized at the hands of police. This bill interferes with the work of Indigenous land defenders and will ultimately have negative environmental impacts. So there are countless other examples of how COVID-19 has been used as a scapegoat for environmental destruction in Canada, and I'm going to name a few. The continued construction of Coastal GasLink pipeline and the use of worker camps on unceded Wet'suwet'en territory. The COVID-19 Emergency Response Act, which contained much needed relief for community, also has buried within it a new law allowing for Export Development Canada to be given more freedom to direct billions of dollars towards oil and gas without any public oversight. The government of Ontario has also suspended public oversight and transparency in environmental decision-making during the COVID-19 emergency. And Ontario has also extended an exemption to the Endangered Species Act, which has been granted to forestry companies. Meanwhile, to add insult to injury, in the midst of a health crisis, we're expected to have an above average wildfire season across the country, meaning we can anticipate reduced air quality in many places, which is expected to worsen the impact of COVID-19, especially for those with asthma and other respiratory illnesses. So I hope this has illustrated why a just recovery from COVID and a movement for climate justice is so tied to the fight for racial justice and against anti-Black racism and colonialism. To sideline anti-racism and anti-colonialism in this work is also to sideline Black, Indigenous, and people of color and their foundational work on solutions to the climate crisis. And what this all illustrates is that we can't go back to what was normal before COVID. We need a just response followed by a just recovery and through to a Green New Deal that seeks to address all of these intersecting crises. So we know this is a lot of information. Just want to mention again that we'll share resources on these subject matters after in a follow-up email, and also some ideas for how you can support Black and Indigenous-led organizations and businesses locally.
Take a moment to really truly think about what Abra's just told us. We need to understand that there is no climate action without climate justice, and there is no climate justice without attacking the underlying systems of oppression that undergird colonialism and capitalism. So we must, as climate activists, always be thinking about the actual roots of the situation and how we got in this fix in the first place. It's like a nesting doll. You can't really take it apart without looking at all of it. So, okay, so without further ado, Tony.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks, Abra. I feel like it's a lot to take in, especially while we're in isolation. But it helps to connect and to know that people all over are having these conversations. And the emerging common theme is we can't and won't go back to normal. We need to fight for a new normal, a just recovery that puts us on the path towards the Green New Deal. Here's a short video outlining a plan for where we go from here.
There are two choices ahead of us. We can either return to a status quo that's destroying the planet for the sake of a wealthy few, or we can leverage this crisis to build a world that works for all of us.
To do so, we, alongside thousands of groups around the world, are calling for a just recovery that puts people before profit.
So how are we going to do it? The only way we are going to win a just recovery is by building a mass, people-powered movement that will fight for it. We're going to need to organize through 3 distinct phases.
First, there's the response. This is the phase that most of us are in right now.
Here, we're responding to the crisis and making sure that people have what they need,
both through mutual aid efforts and by demanding increased government action.
We're also standing up to oil and gas lobbyists and multi-billion-dollar corporations demanding massive bailouts. Soon, we'll move into the recovery phase.
This is when governments will start to reopen the economy and attempt to return us to a normal that has always been deadly and destructive.
During this period, a small corporate elite will be circling like vultures to make billions off the crisis.
They'll sacrifice workers and communities in the name of profit and pressure all levels of government in hopes of lining their pockets with stimulus funding that should be going to everyday people. For us, this is a key phase in the fight for a just recovery. This is the phase where we fight for government action to meet our community's needs instead.
This will lead us into the rebuilding phase. As social distancing is lifted, the wealthy elite and the politicians that serve them will try and claim that we've spent too much over the past months and that we must cut, roll back, and privatize critical public services. For us, this is the time to win the transformative change we need, rebuilding through a made-in-Canada Green New Deal that respects Indigenous rights, creates millions of good jobs, and finally enshrines dignity and justice for all.
If we can bring together enough of our neighbors and friends and convince them to talk to their neighbors and friends about why we need a just recovery, we can get the ball rolling.
Then we'll take action together, likely starting online, but then moving into the streets to put direct pressure on those in power.
Because let's face it, we all have something to lose because of the climate crisis, and we've all been impacted by coronavirus in some way.
Every single one of us has something to fight for right now, and if enough of us come together, we can win a Green New Deal and finally begin building a world that works for all of us, and not just the wealthy few.
Share your thoughts on this three-phase plan in the chat. Do you have top priorities for action? Do you know of corporations or lobbyists who are trying to take advantage of the crisis? I saw already there was a comment in the chat reminding us that people with disabilities are affected by COVID disproportionately and affected by the economic crisis. As all of our support systems are disrupted, people with disabilities are affected that much more. And the federal government has yet to roll out their promised extra support for people with disabilities after 4 months. So that's, I'd love to see other priorities, comments, examples you might like to come up with. Just, keep posting if you feel like it. But in the meantime, I'd just like to highlight some key points from the video. It will take a mass people-powered movement to make a just recovery happen. In the respond phase, we need community self-help as well as government action. We need to oppose bailouts to big business, especially oil and gas companies. In the recover phase, the corporate elite will try to make billions off the crisis, sacrificing workers and communities. We need to fight for government action to meet communities' needs. In the rebuild phase, there's a risk of cuts, rollbacks, and privatization of public services. We need to rebuild through a made-in-Canada Green New Deal that respects Indigenous rights, creates millions of good jobs, and finally enshrines dignity and justice for all. If we come together strongly enough, all our social movements can strengthen each other and make major gains, from anti-racism to disability rights. But we need to amplify the voices of justice-seeking communities and keep insisting no one gets left behind. And finally, action for a just recovery for all is starting online, but then it'll move into the streets. Today's anti-racism movement reminds us that there's really no substitute for occupying public space, and that we can do that while reducing the risk. Have you thought of any more ideas, concerns, or priorities about a just recovery for all? Share them in the chat. I see a comment here, the recovery phase worries me. We need to work hard to shine a bright light on governments who would provide corporate welfare instead of support for our communities. Thank you for that. So to give you some background on the campaign, Just Recovery for All was launched on May 25th by an alliance of over 150 groups representing millions of Canadians. Endorsing organizations include the Canadian Labour Congress, Indigenous Climate Action, Colour of Poverty, Colour of Change, Black Lives Matter Vancouver, the Anglican Church of Canada, Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Fédération des Travailleurs et Travailleuses du Québec, and the Canadian Health Coalition. The campaign is centered on 6 principles. You might like to comment in the chat about whether these principles resonate for you or which resonate the most, or if you think something's missing. I'll read them out. 1, put people's health and well-being first, no exceptions. 2, strengthen the social safety net and provide relief directly to people. 3, prioritize the needs of workers and communities. 4, build resilience to prevent future crises. 5, build solidarity and equity across communities, generations, and borders. 6, uphold Indigenous rights and work in partnership with Indigenous peoples. The first 5 align closely with the United Global Response that has been endorsed by hundreds of organizations around the world. An online petition supporting these principles posted by 350.org has 32,000 shares on Facebook so far. Another global initiative for just recovery is coming out of C40 cities, a network of the world's megacities committed to addressing climate change. Mayor John Tory has joined mayors from all 6 continents in endorsing a statement of principles to rebuild our cities and economies in a way that improves public health, reduces inequality, and addresses the climate crisis. This is what they came up with. You can see how compatible this list is with our Canadian Just Recovery principles and the United Global Response. Notice number 4. The recovery must address issues of equity that have been laid bare by the impact of the crisis. That means learning hard lessons about injustice and inequality and building back better. Of course, it's not enough for the mayor to add his name to a list. We need everyone to know about the commitment he made. We need to have serious conversations about what it means to put that commitment into action, what our vulnerable communities need right now. We need the city to back us up in our demands of the provincial and federal governments for a just recovery for all, where no one gets left behind. And now we'll go back to Megan for what we really want to hear. How do we win?
So, how do we win? Right now, the vast majority of Canadians expect the COVID crisis to result in broad transformations of our society. But the question is really going to be, to whose benefit are these changes being made? Most people want this transformation to fall on the side of everyday working people, transforming our society for all of us and not just the wealthy few. And by everyday working people, we mean both the waged and unwaged. Much labor is done without any wage, and it's almost always about care, and it's almost always carbon neutral or very low carbon. But in truth, just as we always have been, we are up against a very powerful elite who are going to do everything they to do to stand in the way of us making any true progress. That's why we need to have our agenda ready and to be ready to fight with it with everything we've got. So they have money. What do we have? We have people. So the answer is taking collective action. This is a critical time for us as organizers to be bringing people into the movement for climate justice and economic equality. Across this country, there are dozens of teach-ins happening that are just like this one, which we hope will activate hundreds of people just like you to fight for a just recovery. We believe that if we can activate thousands of local networks, neighborhoods, community groups, and families around the world, or around the country, but also around the world because it's an international movement, we can build the kind of mass people-powered movement that we need to win. Here are 3 of the things, and then we'll get to the 4th. 4 of the things you can do coming out of this call to fight for a just recovery. So number 1, you can take action by targeting federal ministers responsible for Canada's climate or just recovery plan, or recovery plan. I don't know if they're calling it just. 2, you can host a teach-in just like this one. It's easy, and 350 Canada will give you everything you need to do it, and just like these slides. And we'll be sending all that information to you at the end anyway. And 3, you can make the determination that you will talk to 5 friends about what they want to see in a just recovery, and ask them to talk to 5 friends or family members about the possibility of a just recovery. We need to make the idea of a just recovery understood by everyone. And then we have local actions. So we really, truly must connect with the migrant justice movement. And there's going to be a digital rally on June 14th. And we strongly recommend and implore you to put your energies behind solidarity actions, as well as the just recovery. So other local actions that you can take that are fundamentally going to be incredibly useful to you. We are asking that we have actually a little art project for you, which is kind of a midway point between being out in the community and sheltering in place during COVID. So we're asking everyone to spend the next week decorating the city with sidewalk chalk or whatever means you would like to decorate. We have a poster that you can put up, and we'd like you to write #JustRecovery and then make whatever art you'd like to. And we invite you to decorate as much of the city as you possibly can. You can, of course, send pictures of your work to our Instagram account, and we will repost it. But then, in a week, we're asking people to, when they're out and about in the community, to look for other people's art. Try to find it and take a selfie and send us the virtual art gallery that is the city, and make the idea of a just recovery for all litter the city with beauty. Other things that you can do are you can sign up for our mailing list, and we can keep you up to date with actions that are happening through Toronto 350, or you can join us for one of our online meetings. We meet every Tuesday at 6:30, and we would really love to have you. And another thing that we're doing during the COVID crisis is we're having a quarantine book club. And right now we're reading A Planet to Win, Case for a Green New Deal. And we have links to all of the books that we're reading, and they're free ebooks. And we meet every other Thursday at 7. And there'll be more information about that in the follow-up email as well. So thank you so much for coming. We really, really appreciate it. And we strongly encourage you to host one of these actions on your own. You can do it for friends, you can do it for family, or you can do it as a larger public meeting as we have. It's pretty easy to set up, and we will help you in any way you need to make your meeting and teach-in a reality if you need it. So now we are just going to go to Colleen, who has been monitoring the chat, and we can answer some of your questions.
Hi, so we didn't get a lot of questions yet. We're still open for questions. I did want to highlight though that I believe there was a private message sent that was meant for everybody to see, and it's an idea that we need to prioritize women in the recovery, including public funded childcare and a stimulus for service jobs. And I thought it was important to share that as well. And we have one new message here. Let me see. Another, a call out. The OFL is coordinating with Fight for 15 and Fairness and Migrant Rights Network to organize a Solidarity for Migrant Workers caravan this Saturday. Thank you for letting us know that, Chandra. I think I said your name right. So if anyone has a question, feel free to type it. If not, do any of my presenters have a response to any of those comments? Oh, Sharon says, is that the Ontario Federation of Labor? OFL. Yes, it is. Thank you, Chandra. So that's great. Oh, here's one. The first part of a just recovery is about health and safety for all. How will we convince the police forces that the health and safety of officers shouldn't trump the health and safety of citizens? So I think, Tony, you had your hand up to speak, but did you want to address that question, or Megan?
Thanks, and Megan as well, of course. It's very close to my heart. First of all, I think that we're in a fantastic situation right now in terms of accountability for police, and even questions of about whether police should be completely rethought. And a fantastic opportunity in Toronto because of the, first of all, the move to defund is one possible way forward of moving resources, some resources from police into other types of measures to keep people safe. But also with the stepping down of the chief, a new chief has to be hired. We can all get involved in that process by demanding what the new chief's qualifications should be. And it's a very important process, and I think that there's a lot of room for improvement here. But the other thing I want to say about the question is that really health and safety is indivisible. The police, as individuals, as people, their health and safety is not divisible from the people that they are serving and protecting. So that's very important to come back to that. Of course, communities that find the police to be a threat definitely feel that their own health and safety is being put at the expense of the way the police perceive their own, or the way they think of health and safety in general. These conflicts are real. However, where we want to get to is that it's actually indivisible. That policing will become a safer job if we do our job to provide the right kinds of health and safety supports for society that we need to. Not to be utopian, but I believe that.
Okay, Megan, I think you have a response.
I think we need to defund and abolish the police. I don't think there's anything worth saving in policing. It has always existed. Policing has always existed to protect property. The RCMP and the Northwest Police Service existed to commit genocide. I think that the things that we think we need the police for do not have to be taken on by a paramilitary organization that has always protected the rich and always plagued poor and racialized communities. Tony is utopian in that he thinks it can be reformed. I think the attempts at reform have been an absolute failure. My utopian imagination imagines a world without police, where if you are in mental crisis, like DeAndre Campbell or Regis Korchinski-Paquette, an armed person doesn't show up at your door. An armed person who has a sense that they're there to keep us in line is not the person who shows up at your door. Someone who understands mental health and understands de-escalation would be far more suited. The child welfare system shouldn't look in someone's cupboard and see it empty and say, well, you can't be a parent. They should just give people food. What we have is a fundamentally punitive system, and it doesn't make us safer. The police don't particularly care if you're the wrong kind of victim, and they only show up after the harm is done. We spend a whole lot of money on something that doesn't work and actively causes harm. Changing their training doesn't work. It's an illegitimate organization. They can try, and they have tried, but fundamentally what we're asking them to do is to plague people. And you can't really fix that culture.
Thank you both. And Abra, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, well, I just want to add that there's some really excellent resources on defunding the police. It's really blown up, at least in my social media, over the last couple of weeks, and has been a very strategic endeavor of Black and Indigenous organizers, mostly Black organizers across the country. So I'll definitely share those resources in the follow-up email. And I just was kind of noting the comparison to this idea of defunding the police to what we've been thinking about as an organization, which is essentially defunding fossil fuel corporations. So I just thought that would be an interesting thing to think about in contrast with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Abra. So we have a question here about, there's a couple, and there's one about where will the money come from? And I think that's referring to making the changes we need in the Green New Deal. Correct me if I'm wrong, but would somebody want to kind of try to address where the money will come from? And while those speakers think, Mary, who's been working really hard in the background on tech here, would like to open a poll for everyone to participate in while we keep talking.
Oh, yes. So I can talk a little bit about how we can pay for this. We can stop subsidizing fossil fuels, for one. There's always as much money as is needed to do harm, so we can shift that money to doing good. We can also close up the tax loopholes that allow wealthy people and corporations to pay very, very little in the way of taxes. And we can also, and I know that this is something that's difficult to get our minds around, we can move the police budget and turn it into something like life-sustaining as opposed to life-destroying. We can move the subsidies that prop up the oil and gas industry and turn it into something else. But what we have to realize is that because we haven't been on the gold standard for a really long time, money is more a matter of whether or not you can buy things with it than it is something that has a limit. Borrowing costs are incredibly low for governments, and deficits only really come up when someone's trying to pay for something life-sustaining. You'll note that when the United States decided to go on an imperialist war splurge 19 years ago, they spent billions and billions of dollars and are still continuing to do so. And no one asked where the money was going to come from. No one asks where the money is going to come from when we're paying for ridiculous machines of war. We are constantly asked to like nickel and dime how we're going to do the things we need to do to save our lives. Corporations, they ask and they receive.
Thank you, Megan. We have a question I think that you might also want to weigh in on, and some other people too, but it's where should we do the chalk drawings?
Anywhere you like. I kind of imagine the city being covered in colorful tags and beautiful children's artwork and adults artwork if you are handy with it. You can do it on sidewalks, you can do it on walls, you can do it in parks. Basically anywhere you go in your sort of limited outside time is a great place to, and if you have a driveway, in your driveway. Any place that you go in your sort of limited COVID outside time is a great place to decorate. And I look forward to peeking under the climbing vines on the side of fancy buildings and seeing Just Recovery for All, possibly Just Recovery for All and Black Lives Matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think it'll be fun. It's like a reverse treasure hunt.
Thank
and
you.
We also have posters, and you can put those up anywhere, and you can put them up in as permanent or as rip downable way as you like.
Yes. So I have one more question here that I think I want to put out because it's a good one. Alan asks, what kind of concrete demands can we put forward to mobilize people to ensure that Canada meets its goal of radically reducing carbon emissions in the context of a just recovery? So his question, I think, is what kind of concrete demands can we put forward? And yeah, that could be a whole range of answers. Anyone want to try? Tony.
Yeah, and just wanted to say I entirely agree with Megan about even though it sounds like we're advocating for different things. Participate in the reform discussions if you feel it's useful, but really what we need is a total abolition of militarized situations in our society. So I'm with Megan 100%. It's just tactics and there's plenty to talk about that. But yeah, in terms of concrete demands, I think that the central thing that connects climate and the COVID recovery is what we do about the fossil fuel companies. They're really hurting, and they absolutely want a lot of subsidies, a lot of money, a lot of deregulation, and we just have to say no. And that's a really strong thing that has to be said by everybody right now. Say no. And there's a lot of good reasons for saying no. Saving the planet is a great one, but also those companies, they don't have economic potential. Basically, the idea that they have a lot of assets that they just need some credit to realize is all about digging more fossil fuels out of the ground and therefore burning up the planet more. Their business model is based on the destruction of the planet. It's not a real business model. Those assets deserve to be stranded. So therefore, cut the fossil fuel companies off. There are many other things that can be done too, but I think that's sort of, for me, the most important.
Yeah, great. That's great. There were a few other ideas about the money earlier on. One of them was about the subsidies. I just want to read those out. And then fair tax of the wealthy, managing the offshore
Yep.
tax havens, get the money out of the military, yes, ending the fossil fuel subsidies would provide billions. So right, and they also have the Export Development Corporation investments the government uses to invest so heavily in oil. It's come out that we're at the top of, I think, top of the G20 or something of how much we put into the fossil fuels through that as well. And I think Abra would like to say more.
Yeah, thanks. I have a couple of thoughts. One is about the money. Just being inspired by the fact that suddenly there was money for COVID. Like this idea that there's no money is kind of overinflated, I think. And I think that the COVID situation has shown us that there could be money for social programs. There could be money to support people. And then in terms of concrete demands to mobilize people to reduce carbon emissions, I would say to support the sovereignty of Indigenous people on their own land would do a great deal of reducing carbon emissions, because some Indigenous groups are quite against the fossil fuel corporations being on their land at all. Yeah, just a thought.
Great. Somebody's also mentioning divestment for institutions and for citizens. Do any of the Toronto 350 people want to talk a little bit about divestment, or just reinforce that point? I think it's a great point. Bankrupt the fossil fuel companies, yay! Yes. So that in coupling that with giving the workers the help that they need to transition, and the communities and the people that will be affected by the transition, I think that would be a really great move. That's what we want to see. Yes. Natasha, one of our Toronto 350 people, Natasha, has an S in the box. Can we let her speak?
Just before Natasha pipes in, I'd just also like to say that we can change the way we subsidize agriculture so that we can move more of our agricultural subsidies away from large agribusiness and back towards farmers that are farming on a smaller scale. And we can also push those subsidies towards agriculture that is both respectful of the land, of the animals, and of the workers. So we could say, if you're going to use migrant labor and abuse them and expose them to COVID, then no, you will not get subsidies. This is a basic issue of equity, and we can also use that to make agriculture a part of the solution to the climate crisis as opposed to an aggravating factor. Natasha, are you ready?
Hi, I just, when you mentioned divestment, it's just that, as you guys know, since I'm in 350 with you, that myself and a very small group of people who are trying to divest the teachers' pension plan from fossil fuels. And I've been noticing an upsurge in interest from people divesting not just pension plans, but institutions like University of California and so on. And my feeling has been from the get-go, and that's actually why I joined 350, is that, as somebody just said, starve the oil companies, I think it was, that's I think one of the most effective paths forward. So I think anyone who's able to in some way engage either with the institution, pension plan they're part of, or personal banking, it can be hard and confusing, but I think it's one of the most productive paths forward, and it's something that I want to keep working on. And I'm following in the lead of some people who saw this idea far before I did. So just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. And of course, I believe in the US, 350 is leading the charge on Stop the Money Pipeline, which might have some resources for people if you want to look, even though it's a US-centered one, Stop the Money Pipeline. And Sharon has, she's included a Canadian initiative that's going on right now in the chat. So that's pretty cool. We also have a few resources at Toronto 350, so we can provide them in the follow-up email. Erica says we need more local farming. Yes, in different ways to do farming and more biodiversity as well, which means there'll be less chance for pandemics. That's a great point. And on that point, do you want to hear the results of the poll, Mary? Yes. Whoa, okay. Thanks, Mary. That's really helpful. Wow.
Well, that's very exciting. I'm interested in talking about building resilience and how we can change our city to actually deal with the issue of climate crisis. I mean, as you may or may not know, we are at the base in Toronto, at the base of a massive watershed. And one of the things that's going to happen in our area is that we're just going to get more rain. And that's why basements flood all the time, and why my street down in Parkdale turns into a river every time we get heavy rain. So fundamentally rethinking like the materials that we use that just wick the water off and don't allow it to seep into the ground. And the way that we've buried all our rivers is something kind of exciting that we can talk about as we try to find ways to reshape and rewild our city so that we can actually weather this storm. So basically, I'm excited about the idea of maybe talking about that in another teach-in.
Yes, and I'm excited about everybody working together to talk to the federal ministers that are responsible for that green recovery plan. That is awesome. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to seeing the chalk drawings too. So I think, yeah, so there aren't any more questions right now. So does anybody else on the panel want to say a goodbye?
Well, just another huge thanks to the people behind the scenes. Colleen is no longer behind the scenes, but she has been throughout the teach-in before the end part here. And it's also Mary and Sharon who have been managing tech, and so definitely thanks so much.
And Dawn.
Hi, I'm Dawn. I'm sorry. Yes, of course. I'm Dawn.
I wanted to add for the chalk images, I got a question about if you don't have social media, if you want to send an emailed photo to us, you could contact communications@toronto350.org. That's another option.
You could also probably tweet it at us, and we can, if you don't have, if you don't have Instagram, you can tweet it to us and we'll send it over to Instagram. But we'd love to have a fun reverse treasure hunt.
I also think we're open to feedback and you guys responding to our follow-up email if you want to get involved in 350, or if you have an idea for a project related to the subject matter, you want to share it with us, that would be awesome.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yes.
It was really great.
Thanks, everyone.
And wonderful.
Thank you so much.